Okay, well, it looks like it's 11 o'clock, so welcome everyone to our Get to Know Hilo Summit webinar. Thank you for joining us. My name is Tanya Trafford, and I oversee the Orca Book Publishers' successful lines of books created for striving readers of various ages. And while we have people joining us from all over the country, first I'd like to acknowledge that Orca Book Publishers is situated on the unceded Coast Salish territory of the Lekwungen and Wasanich nations. And we're going to talk about specific Hilos in a moment, but to get started, I want to mention a couple of things. First, tomorrow, February 17th, is I Read Canadian Day. It's a national celebration, yay, of the richness and diversity of Canadian literature. And it challenges us. We all have to spend 15 minutes reading a Canadian book, and maybe that'll be a book you hear about today. You can read or learn more about this. Reading is great too, at ireadcanadian.com. And I think that we're going to put some of these links that I mentioned into our chat if we can. So you can grab them as it suits you. And I also want to mention to our registrants, there's going to be a question period at the end of the session. I'll do my best to address as many of the questions as I can. But if we don't get to your question, you should feel free to send it to us by email or at info@orcabook.com or any of our social media platforms. We are at OrcaBook on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And do remember to put your questions in the chat, not in the chat, but in the Q&A section. Thank you. And maybe I'll start with a little introduction of what is Hilo before I introduce all our lovely panelists. That Hilo term is the industry-wide, it's not formal, it's just an informal term to describe books that are specifically written for readers who, for whatever reason, are having difficulty reading. It could be they have a learning disability or a short attention span, or maybe English isn't their first language, or maybe they just really love their phone. So yeah, the assumption is there are many reasons, and so we try to make our books as accessible as we can. The high is for high interest. The low is the reference to the reading level. The books are short, age appropriate, simple vocabulary and sentence structure. So an Orca Currents title, for example, is specifically for middle schoolers. It's about things that tweens like to read about and can relate to. They're just easier to read. Our collection includes contemporary stories, humor stories, mysteries, fantasy. We've added fantasy recently. The Orca Soundings is for anyone 12 and up, and they can be a little bit grittier, dealing with maybe darker themes that teens are dealing with, facing, can relate to. But we also have some lighter stories in the collection too, some romance and sci-fi and mystery for readers just looking for an escape. The approximate range of the reading level is between 2.0 and 4.5. There are a bunch of different ways of grading these, and there's a Fry level, there's Flesch Kincaid. We have more information on our website if you want to dive in a little bit deeper, or I can answer your questions more specifically at the end of the session. We also, we have quite a number of titles in our catalog, and it's very successful across North America, but there's also been an increasing demand for books at an even lower reading level, so under 2.0. So we have a line of much shorter books with reading levels under 2.0 in development. So stay tuned for more details about this exciting initiative. We're going to be launching the inaugural season of Orca Anchor in early 2022. So those are the basics. And if you want to know more specifics, you can ask in the Q&A and I'll answer them at the end of the session. And some of those might be answered as we talk to the panelists. So I think I will get on to introducing our lowly panelists and actually some of my favorite people. Maybe you can all give a little wave or a bow if you're feeling formal when I mention your name. And I'm going to read from my notes. Try not to do too much of that, but I don't want to miss any of the good, juicy details about your books. So first up, we have Brooke Carter, author of 6 Hilo titles so far. Her most recent soundings is Double or Nothing, about a teen math genius with a serious gambling problem. There it is. Kirkus Reviews called it a royal flush of a read for reluctant readers, and it was a Junior Library Guild Gold Standard selection. So that's Brooke. Next we have, so far we're working clockwise according to my screen, but I'm really just going alphabetical. Next is Marty Chan, award-winning playwright and author, and of several novels for middle and young adult readers, including the Orca Currents titles Haunted Hospital, there it is, and Kung Fu Master, which made the Canadian Children's Book Centre Best Books for Kids and Teens list. Marty also created a terrific I Read Canadian pre-show showcasing all sorts of Canadian talent. So if you didn't catch that on Saturday, you can find it on YouTube. And I think Cabri is going to put a link in the chat. That was fabulous, Marty. Thank you. Paul Kaccha is the author of the Orca Soundings title Cub. There it is, little cute Theo on the cover. A teen baker who gets into hot water after entering a cooking contest. CM Review called it an encouraging and necessary story and a book that will start important conversations among younger readers, librarians, and educators. Paul is the creator of the original hashtag Get to Know Hilo. Thank you for sharing that, Paul. And a huge supporter of the I Read Canadian movement and Canadian writers in general. Natasha Deen, resident troublemaker. We all voted and you won. Is the award-winning author of many books of various genres, including several Orca Hilos. Her soundings title, Thicker Than Water, was on the Red Maple Summer Reading List, was on the CCBC Best Book for Kids and Teens list, and was a Junior Library Guild Gold Standard selection. Kirkus said that for readers with a taste for crime, this title should scratch the itch. Love that. Melanie Florence is an award-winning author of several books in various genres, including the Orca Hilo titles He Who Dreams, about a boy trying to juggle the Irish and Cree sides of his heritage, and its companion and novel Dreaming in Color, starring the He Who Dreams protagonist's little sister. Kirkus called it a rare and welcome reluctant reader title featuring an Indigenous protagonist. Last but not least, we have Tash Mcadam. They are the author of several sci-fi novels and 3 Orca Hilo titles. Their first one, Bloodsport, about a trans teen investigating his sister's murder, there it is, was a Junior Library Guild Gold Standard selection and made the American Library Association's 2021 Rainbow Book List. That just happened, really exciting. Them magazine described the book as having the tough shell of a noir, but a tender underbelly, making a great read for those looking for a realistic, like trans-affirming fiction. I love that. Okay, so that's our crew. And now I'm going to ask them some really hard questions. Just kidding. So I'm going to ask the question and then I'll pick one of you to answer it. And then if others want to add anything, you feel free, just wave, or has anyone tried this little raise your hand button? See if that works. Oh yeah, there you go. I see at least 3 and now they're going good. Yeah, I think you have to take them off yourself. Okay, I'll start with an easy one. All of you have written in other genres, but keep coming back to Hilo. What is it about this format that you find appealing? Natasha, why don't we start with you?
Oh, I knew you were going to do that. I did. Well, you know, not to be glib, but what about this genre isn't appealing? And what about this category isn't fun to write? You know, so from a writing perspective, like what a cool thing to tell a big giant story in a very set time frame, like in terms of word count, right? And I don't know which author it was that said, I'm writing you a long letter because I don't have the time to write you a short one. And it's that kind of thing. So, I mean, I love it because they're big stories, they're fast paced, they're snappy, they're perfect for striving readers, but they're also really perfect for when you're on vacation and you want like a fast read, when you're at the doctor's office and you want to be able to get through like a couple of those chapters really quick. So for me, it's like anything and everything about writing for Soundings and Currents is just so much fun and so magnificent. So that is my answer. Everything, Miss Trafford, everything.
Very good answer, Miss Deen. Melanie, is there something particular about the Hilo format that you like? I mean, does it give you more freedom than, say, a picture book, or maybe it's the opposite?
You know, I like I did unmute, right? Yeah. I love that it dives right into the story. You know, there's something really satisfying to me, both as a writer and a reader, that you open the book and immediately, you know, you are just bam, smack in the middle of the adventure and the excitement. And there's something just I find really satisfying that, you know, you're just immersed in it immediately. I think that's just fantastic.
Yeah, I love that diving right in. That definitely is something we look for immediately. Okay, well, thank you both. The next question I want to know is, what is something you find challenging about writing for this audience? Brooke, do you want to take this one? Brooke, we can't hear you. Sorry, Brooke. You're gonna have to start over.
Can you hear me now? Yeah? Except I can't hear you, so I'm just going to keep talking.
Yes.
Okay. Oh, now I can hear you. Sorry about that. Well, not being able to use metaphor, unless you're really, really careful, not being able to always use the words that you like. Sometimes your sentences will be really long and complex, and it'll have that beautiful musicality that we're always striving for, but then it ends up being too hard to read, so it has to be cut, or you need to change words and names to alter your diction and use less complicated words. That's a challenge, trying to retain the artfulness of your prose while also making it simpler. But I think it's a constant exercise in clarity, which I think every writer can benefit from. I know that I can. And it's to the point now, after having written 6 of them, that I'll pick up certain books that are not Hilos, and I almost get a little bit irritated by the unnecessary floweriness of the language or needlessly complicated sentences. And so for me, I tend to approach them like I write a screenplay, and I really focus on structure and clarity. I like things to be image heavy and to really get into the action, as already has been said, and just keep moving it forward with that relentless kind of pace.
Yeah, thank you, Brooke. I too find that it affects my reading of other genres. When I'm editing a middle grade standalone, for example, I might flag something and go, oh wait, this isn't a Hilo. And then go, wait a minute, but is it, do we need that? Yeah, so I totally know what you mean there. Tash, Boreda, I'm going to pick on you next because you are one of the first to have written for our new anchor line. So cutting your word count in half must have been a little tough. Do you want to speak to some of the challenges of writing in an even shorter form?
Sure, yeah. With soundings, I find that I actually write like that very naturally. When I'm not writing soundings, I always have to go back in and add to the description and the metaphor. I'm by nature a very stark, like, linear writer, and I tend to just focus on the action and immediate emotion. So for me, soundings came quite easily. But when I was switching to anchor, I'd never done that before. It was a much lower reading level, so I had to be much more careful with language, even names and things. Like, had to rename a cat because the word I chose was too difficult for the cat's name. And just crushing that story right down so it fitted into that small spaces. It was an interesting exercise because it was a science fiction as well, whereas before I was writing short contemporaries, and with sci-fi, you do need a lot more description and you do need to explain what's going on in the wider world. So I had a lot more edits for that. I would say that Tanya's role was much more vital to the production of the final piece. Obviously, it's always vital. But yeah, my edits for Anchor came back and I was like, I did not nail this one first time.
Well, that is not true. Sometimes I like to feel useful. And everyone, just so you know, the anchor title that Tash wrote is a creepy little sci-fi thriller called The Ooze. And it might give you nightmares. Watch out for it in January 2021. And the cat, if you want to know, I secretly tell you what his name used to be. Okay, so other than how mean your editor can be, what's something that surprised you during the editing process? Paul, I'm going to start with you. Do you have anything, do you want to talk about anything that happened during the Cub editing process that you totally weren't expecting?
Not that I wasn't expecting it, but was always a surprise to see the things that snuck past me. So I know there's a part at the end where Theo is wearing a quilted apron, and that was your genius, Tanya. I'm giving you all the credit. Snuck right past me that I threw in the word applique. And he was wearing an applique bear on this apron. And when you pointed out that applique is too big and long a word to use for a Hilo reader, and while technically correct, it was just going to throw the whole thing under the bus, and I had done it. And I was like, how did I not see that? Why wasn't I smart enough? And I was like, oh, because I focused on applique being the right thing. And I think my response to you was, yeah, change it to quilted. That's totally okay. The feeling's there. So sometimes you have to make those choices, and things will get past you. It doesn't mean you're a bad writer, which is what, when people ask me, like, can I shorten things? Can I do this? I'm like, you're a great writer. Things will go past you, and your editor isn't going to think you're a dummy. You're not. You just didn't see applique. You threw it in there. But that's why editors are great, because they're going to pull those things out and say, that's not the one for you.
Thanks, Paul. And actually, that's a good reminder for me that every little comment might be taken in such like great fashion that I'm just talking about an apron, dude, but you know, it might be really important, and I have to be careful with the way I present stuff to you, because I'm beginning in work mode, and sometimes I can be a bit blunt, and I do try not to be mean. So thank you. That's pretty interesting. Is there anyone else who wants to offer up anything? Any terrible tales? Okay, Brooke.
Hopefully I'm unmuted now. Yeah, okay. So, I mean, I've been lucky enough to work with Tanya on, I think, like 7 or 8 books now. And sometimes it's scary because I will have some doubt about my manuscript, or will have struggled with a certain aspect of the story. But like, I've kept it secret to myself. And then I get the first round edits back from her, and she has managed to like laser focus on whatever that issue was. And I'm like, can she read my mind? And so it's a little bit freaky sometimes. Or there'll be little notes in the margins that fully call out all the weak bits that I knew were weak, but just couldn't deal with at the time. But of course, there's no mystery to it. It's just her experience and talent as an editor.
Oh, well, thank you. That's so sweet. Okay, so let's move on. Let's talk about schools. I always love hearing testimonies from students and teachers. Tash, I'm going to ask you again. You're not only a writer, but also a teacher for the Target Soundings readership. So I'm wondering what kind of feedback you get on those titles from your students.
I'm a substitute teacher, which means I don't have my own classroom, but I'm going into English classrooms in different schools all over Vancouver. And often teachers will leave 20 minutes silent reading as part of their day, because obviously we're really trying to encourage students to read, especially in these extra long blocks that we've got now. We know they're not reading outside of the classroom, and I will go to the library and come back with a handful of Orca soundings and currents, and I spread them out over the desk. And for the inevitable students who have forgotten their books, which most of the time they haven't forgotten their books, they just want to be on their phone during that time. And I'll be like, here are all the books you could have. They're all quite short and quick, so you'll be able to read them in this block. And every single time they're reluctant, and as soon as they pick them up, I can see them getting into them. Like the way that Orca has structured their stories, the way it brings students in, young people in immediately, is so brilliant. Like there isn't that stage where you're just kind of like trying to find out who the character is or what the story is going to be. You're dropped straight into it. And for that kind of environment, it's so engaging. You can see them going from, I don't really want to read, to being like, I am in this book now. It's so satisfying when at the end of silent reading, they then are like, at their desks, like reading it under the table. I'm like, sorry guys, we actually have to do other work now.
That's great. thank you for being such a great ambassador. That's amazing.
I did that long before I wrote for Orca, just so you know. It's been my move since I discovered the Hilo lines.
Melanie, I was going to ask you because the Hilo stories you've written center around Indigenous main characters, and you also offer workshops to students to help them explore their own cultures and stories. I imagine that leads to some pretty interesting and amazing interactions. Did you want to talk a little bit about that?
It's kind of funny. That wasn't my idea. Somebody actually asked me if I would be willing to do that. And I thought, how hard can it be? Oh boy, I had no idea, because I went into a group of kids and there were so many of them who felt like they had no cultural background to talk about. So we had to explore what that actually meant. Like, it doesn't necessarily mean what your heritage is, like where your family comes from, but you know, it can have so many different avenues of inspiration, I guess, in their writing. So there was a lot of things that we had to explore. There was this one girl who was extremely upset because she kept saying, like, we don't really celebrate any special holidays. We're not religious. We don't like come from anywhere. We're basically, you know, just boring. We don't do anything. And so I had to kind of sit down with her and say, okay, so let's talk about what your family does together. Like, and they were all musicians, and they would get together and they would all bring their instruments and they would just play music. And I thought, there's part of what your identity is. So the fact that we don't all have this clear-cut idea of where we come from and who we are and how that forms us, it's a really interesting thing to me, to sit down with a bunch of kids to start talking about what makes them who they are, and sort of trying to explain to them, like, you know, who you are is formed by so many different things and so many different influences, and that can inform your writing. So when you do writing workshops about, you know, cultural identity and like all these different things where kids just don't necessarily have a clear idea of what that entails and what can inform, you know, like, just it's fascinating to me. And it was a real learning experience to me to talk to kids from different religious backgrounds and cultural backgrounds and all kinds of different things that just made them who they are and made them, you know, unique, and made their writing experiences unique. Did that make any sense at all?
Yes. Yeah, Melanie, that gave me goosebumps. So you talk about the musicians, and I'm picturing this child realizing, I do have a culture. This is my culture. And that, to me, encapsulates why I love working in children's publishing, because you never know what story or what conversation is going to switch that light on for a kid. And that is an amazing privilege. And I think all of you do that so well in just telling stories that kids can relate to, but you never know which kid is going to need that, like not just enjoy it, but need it. So thank you. Marty, you also do a lot of school visits. You've done them over the years, so you probably have some great stories. Do you care to share a couple of inspiring ones? And I'd also love to hear more about how you've adapted your visits during this pandemic.
Thanks, Tanya. I love those moments when the light bulb goes on for kids. I remember pre-pandemic, I did a school visit for a school down in southern Alberta. And it was one of those schools where it was K to 8, and the session was going to be for grade 4 to 8. And, you know, there's a world of difference between a kid in grade 4 and a kid in grade 8. And all grade 4s, grade 5s, as soon as they got into the gym, they would just like scooch up right to the front and sit down right at my feet. The grade 7s reluctantly sat somewhat close, but there's like this huge gap between the grade 6s and the grade 7s. And then the grade 8s are hanging out against the wall, just refusing to even partake. Eventually, the teachers were able to get everyone to sit sort of in a group, but there was one boy who just refused to do anything. And so he just leaned up against the wall. And I didn't care because I had a microphone, so I knew that he could hear me from wherever he stood. And as I was doing my presentation, every now and then, I would just throw him some eye contact and just let him know, I know you're here, and I'm just doing this story for some of the kids here, and sometimes the stories will be for you. as the presentation went on, I think about 15 minutes in, he sort of moved from his position against the wall to leaning up against the gym mats, which was sort of like halfway point between the back wall and me. And so I just, kept throwing him eye contact. And by the end of the presentation, that grade 8 boy is sitting in the front row beside a bunch of grade 4 kids. And when I ask for questions, his hand is the first one that goes up. And for me, that's a moment when you know that you've made a connection with a kid. And I know that all of these authors here who are doing presentations are doing that exact same thing. It's just sometimes you're lucky enough that you see that moment, and sometimes you'll hear about that moment later on, or at least the parents and the teachers will hear about that moment, about kids being so excited about a presentation. So that to me is my favorite memory. Pre-pandemic, in the pandemic, it's all changed. Now I'm just staring at like blank cameras and hoping microphones are on. So the adjustment to try to connect with kids has caused me to do all sorts of shifts in terms of how I present. So I have to find graphics to bring up. So I talk about Kung Fu Master, which was inspired by my childhood hero, Bruce Lee, who basically inspired this whole notion of a kid who is mistakenly assumed to know Kung Fu because he happens to be Chinese. And when I do presentations virtually, I have to find ways to keep the audience on their toes. So, because they're staring at a screen, I have the real estate here on the screen to do all sorts of cool things. So sometimes when I'm talking about Kung Fu Master, I talk about my inner Kung Fu Master and how he can sometimes make an appearance sort of unexpectedly. So I have to say, stop upstaging me, get out of here, right? And what it does is it surprises the kids and makes them go, hey, we should be watching this. And so every now and then, just throwing up a little bit of sorry, that's a little too much. Okay, so out you go. All right, so by just having those little moments of surprises, it keeps the kids engaged. And you just got to find a way in a virtual world to, oh, seriously, dude? Okay, you just want the attention right now. Okay, how about this? Kung Fu move. Hi-ya! All right, so there's a little bit of what I try to do in virtual visits.
Thanks, Marty. That was awesome. And for anyone who is interested, you should go check out Marty's Prompt My Story series on YouTube that he developed during, you can't say post-pandemic, we're still in it, pandemic. So yeah, thank you. And that was a lot of fun. You're a wizard. Since we're on this topic of pandemics though, and getting creative about book promotion, I have a little bit thing to read to you here. Orca offers ebook formats for all of our books and that we publish, and we're now offering digital subscriptions to for our Hilo collections, which are great for classrooms, virtual or otherwise. There's more information about digital subscriptions under the For Teachers tab on the Orca website, where the collections are grouped by theme and content, so you can find exactly what you need. And I think to move on to my next question, I think it's fair to say that most of you wrote stories that you wish you had access to when you were young. First of all, thank you for that. I wonder if anyone would like to comment on what else we could be doing or other kinds of stories you'd like to see. I'm not asking for anyone to give away their future book pitches, secret ones, just a general idea. Natasha, what do you think?
So it's sort of twofold, because going back to the question of what is a challenge is, if anyone goes on, if you go onto the Orca website and you look at soundings and you look at currents, what you see is that there is a treasure trove, there is a wealth of just amazing stories. And so the challenges sometimes can be, where do you find the imaginative story and where do you find the new story? And so I think to anyone who's looking to write for Orca Hilo, it's not necessarily that you need to reinvent the wheel per se. I think it's about finding, like you said, Tanya, I think that was really well said, that finding the story that you wished you could have read when you were a kid, and putting a new twist on old fairy tales or those template stories that we already know. And I would encourage the emerging writers that you have a voice and you have a story to tell, and it is going to be glorious and wonderful. And we want to hear it and we want to read it. So even though it can be daunting and it, can be kind of frustrating, like Brooke was saying with, you got to pull out the metaphors, and Paul was talking about the appliques, write that story. That first draft will be for you. And then in the subsequent drafts, remember that this story is an act of love to your reader. This is an act of kindness. And so it's not necessarily a challenge. It is this like beautiful gift that you give to a kid who just needs that little bit of extra gentleness and kindness. And, when I talk to really established writers who are award-winning and whose books are in reprints and it's like selling in the millions, and the amount of times I hear them talking about, I really struggled as a kid with reading. I really struggled with writing. And, your stories and the Orca stories, they are the thing that can launch a lifelong reader and a kid who becomes an adult that is curious about the world and continues to be curious as they go along. So that would be my input on it.
Yeah, that's great, Natasha. Thank you. It made me think, though, that when you're talking, you're very passionate about what you do. And I think all of you are. And I can tell you right now, I can tell the difference of someone writing a story, trying to get published, versus someone writing a story because the story needs to be told, or the readers need this story. There's a big difference. It shows in the words. It comes across. Paul, how about you? I was thinking specifically because of the education process we went through in the book that was called Cub and then was called a whole bunch of other things and then came back to being called Cub, because there wasn't really a full understanding of the subculture that was being related to and all of that. So do you want to talk about what else we can be doing out there? And
Yeah, I owe Orca a huge thank you, because I never thought Cub would actually be a book that came into print, and I didn't realize its power, but you did, Tanya. I sent in a bunch of pitches, and I had two top ones. One was called Chaser and one was called Cub, and those were the two I kind of hoped that you would want. But I thought Chaser's better, and there's a thing in the gay community where thinner guys go after heavier set guys. And I know it's not specific just to the gay community. I thought, that's the character people want to hear about, and how his desire is not mainstream. And Tanya was very smart and said, no, go for Cub. That's the character that I think is good, and take Chaser and kind of make him a secondary character. So it was all thanks to you. And I think that's what Orca does really well, is it takes risks. It brings out stories that maybe even the author didn't realize were important. And it was through publishing Cub I realized how important this was to a lot of gay men who haven't felt seen and who have felt like, I don't conform, especially the way I look in gay culture. There's very set ways I can be. I'm either fat and funny and not sexy, or I'm very thin and model-esque. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of in-between, and Cub ended up being an in-between book. And I think Orca has an eye for those in-between books. And I'm so excited you're doing sci-fi and fantasy. I'm a huge fantasy reader. It's my favorite. So when you're saying, what do I want to see? I love fantasy, more of that.
that's good to hear. And, I appreciate you're always so nice to me. But there's several layers in the publishing. Like if it wasn't for Andrew being completely open to taking big risks, he does it all the time. That has to be coming from the top down. So very grateful that Orca is structured that way. So yeah, thanks for the reminder. Does anyone else want to talk on that before I move on about kinds of books? Or okay, Tash.
I just wanted to add on to what Paul said about the science fiction and fantasy. In non-accessible formats, they are so challenging to read. Like, I have kids who are EL who are trying to read Harry Potter, where every third word is invented. They're so much more challenging than contemporary books in so many ways, because of the language choices and the description choices, and because of the lack of shared context. So I think that there is a huge gap for accessible science fiction and accessible fantasy, where kids are starving for content that they can access and read and enjoy without missing a third of it because they don't understand the language being used. So I get kids asking all the time for like easy, accessible sci-fi and fantasy. So please write those.
That's a great point. Thank you. And we have just recently added some fantasy titles to Soundings. We got the Arthur Slade, Mr. Universe, and some more coming down the pipe. But that actually rolls into my next question about accessibility in terms of its format, because all our Hilos are now being, make sure you get this, all the details in here, published in a ultra readable format, designed to be more accessible for readers with dyslexia or other language-based learning difficulties. The books have specific features such as larger trim size, more readable font, and cream-colored paper. And some of you have seen your books in this format. So Brooke, your book Double or Nothing was one of the first to come out in this new format. What did you think when you first saw it?
Well, I love it. I think they look really good. I think I like the newer kind of design aesthetic. So this is my first book that came out in 2016, and it looks similar to a lot of the books in that range at that time. And these newer formats are bigger, and I feel like they look like a fuller length novel, which I think maybe might matter to some readers. I think when you're a teenager and you're struggling to read, you want the books that you're reading to look like the books that other people are reading too. So that's a big thing for me. I think they look more substantial. And personally, I suffer from a lot of eye strain and other issues. And I find it a lot easier on the eye with this kind of creamy colored background. Instead of that bright white, I find sometimes difficult to read. So I just think that anything that helps to remove a barrier to reading is a good thing. And, you know, I think if we're putting in the effort to craft the stories that are interesting to readers, to hook them, that the books themselves need to be accessible as well. And I think that's, you know, a great step forward.
Yeah, thank you. Marty, but what about you? Did you had any specific feedback about Haunted Hospital?
Yeah, there was actually a school that I was at. I can't remember how far back it was, but it was a school that had some. I went and talked to a class that had some reluctant readers, and I remember after I left, I got an email from the librarian who said that one of her students, I think it was a grade 5 boy, when he picked up Haunted Hospital, he proudly claimed that this was the first book that he read by himself from cover to cover. He didn't need any help, anybody beside him to sound out anything. So in terms of ultra readable format, and obviously he did have some dyslexia, but he was able to get through that. And that moment of pride, because I know from my own personal experience, because I started as a reluctant reader, that moment of joy when you turn that last page and go, I read this by myself, you can't take that away from somebody, that moment of accomplishment and that moment of joy and that desire to do it again. And so by having something like an ultra readable format that wins over that reluctant reader and converts them into a lifelong lover of books, I mean, you can't go wrong with something like that. I think it's one of those things where it's a small moment. I love what was said about how it does look like sort of like what other books are being picked up. And for me, you know, think about this. If you're a teenager, you're self-conscious about any number of given things. And if size matters in terms of books, and you just alter the size of a book just slightly so that a kid goes, I'm happy to walk through this, that's great. And it's not something that's limited to kids either. I know that when Harry Potter came out, they had to come out with adult covers because adults were embarrassed to be holding a kid's book. So if you think about the universal nature of our own self-consciousness, you recognize that finding those little moments that overcome those hurdles mean a world of difference to kids.
Thanks, Marty. That was amazing. And yeah, I mean, I work inside and I don't get outside into where the books are going very often. So it's really nice to hear these stories. So the last thing I wanted to do before we go and see what kind of questions our viewers have for us is to ask each of you to recommend a Hilo written by someone else. I think I'm going to work my screen clockwise based on who I can see. Maybe your screens are different. So Natasha, I'll start with you, please.
Yes, my recommendation is Sean Rodham's Night Terrors. It is so creepy. I am someone, if you can't catch me in the first 5 pages, I'm out. I mix up letters, I mix up numbers. Reading is a thing for me. So I remember picking up this book and just being like, nope, the world can end. And, you know, if it's a Pompeii, they will find me with this book in my hand. It's creepy. It's got like a kid who's mourning the loss of his brother. You've got like a terrible boss. You've got a snowstorm. You've got isolation. You've got a ghost. Like, oh my gosh, Sean Rodham packed so much into this book. And there's never like, you know, it doesn't matter how many times I read it, I still get the chills and the goosebumps and the cliffhangers and like, okay, I've just gotta, you know, even though I know how it ends, it's like, okay, one more page, one more chapter. So that is a huge recommend from me.
Okay, thanks. I actually haven't read that one. Sorry, Sean. We have so many. I've read a lot of them, but that's not one I've read. So I'm going to now. Thank you. Marty, how about you? Marty, yeah, you're gonna have to start over.
Anyway, so the secret to life is, oh no, sorry, okay, never mind. Pia's Plans, Alice Kuipers is a fantastic writer. And what I love, like I love thrillers, I love fantasy, but when you give me a great character, and especially a great character in a short form, the character of Pia is identifiable. I keep thinking about how I want to cheer for her because I have that same kind of anxiety that she's going through. And I keep thinking about what I was like as a kid and all the things that I would have had to deal with. She captures those moments of self-consciousness perfectly. And she does it in a way that isn't, I mean, it's one of those things that if you're over a certain age, when you write for kids, there is the slight tendency for you to layer in the adult wisdom or judgment onto kids. And I find that when a writer can take away that adult version and just be on the street level with that kid and see the world the way that kid sees the world, those are the moments that I love. And I think Alice Kuipers has a brilliant ability to sort of forget about being an adult and just go, this is the life of a kid and all the neuroses that they have to deal with. So Pia's Plans, definitely something I would recommend checking out.
That's great. Thank you. And Allie is also a lovely, lovely person. It reminded me, as soon as you pulled that cover up though, our Hilo designer name is Ella. She is amazing and comes up with multiple treatments for the cover for our first discussion. And sometimes it goes really well. Sometimes it's back and forth, trying to find the right image to portray the story and consider the audience, et cetera, et cetera. This one, as soon as I saw this image, I'm like, that is her. Like, it was instantaneous. So it was a really nice feeling. I'd forgotten that until I saw the cover. Thanks. Okay, next on my screen is Tash. Would you like to promote some?
Sure. I read a lot of Orca Hilos, so I have to go for something that I've read relatively recently in the scheme of things. Otherwise, they kind of like blur into each other a little bit, not because they're all the same, but because I read literally hundreds of them. So I'm going to recommend Hey Jude by Star Spider, which I just got to take out from one of the school libraries last week. It's about a girl who is dealing with her sister who is suffering from depression. And whilst it can be really challenging to write about a family member's issues and do it sensitively and not prioritize the kind of point of view character's experiences over the family member, I thought Star Spider did an incredible job with balancing that. And it's just so beautifully written and so insightful. And it made me cry like 3 or 4 times throughout the book. And I thought it was wonderful. So highly recommend that. Hey Jude by Star Spider.
Thank you. Brooke, how about you?
Well, as luck would have it, I am also recommending Hey Jude by Star Spider for all of those same reasons. I just found it so incredibly relatable. And as we were saying before, you know, it's the kind of book that I really needed to read as a teenager, but I never found. And it just was so incredibly moving, and I cried and cried and cried, and I thought it was wonderful.
Sorry, I got lost in my, where's my button? Thank you, Brooke, and nice to have 2 shout outs for Hey Jude. Melanie, how about you?
Okay. This, I'm sorry, but I have to say this. 2 of my favorite people in the world are on this panel, and they wrote 2 of my favorite Hilo books. Cub by Paul is one of the greatest Hilo books I have ever read. I absolutely adore it. And Thicker Than Water by Natasha is the other one that, and I texted her right after I read it, didn't I, Natasha? And just said, oh my God, I just like both of them. I couldn't stop sort of living in their worlds for those moments that I was reading them. And Paul's book in particular stuck with me after I closed it. And that to me is the sign of such great writing and great characterization. So although they are my friends, I have to say that even if they weren't my friends, I think I could honestly say that those are 2 of just the greatest written Hilos that I have ever read. And Marty, I just got Haunted Hospital yesterday, so I am super excited to dive into that one. The cover is fantastic.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you so much. And Cub author Paul is getting lots of
I have a
mentions.
stack of like 30 Hilos right beside me, and I recommend everyone's on this panel. I could pull out any, but this is the last one I read, and I love it. It's Finders Keepers by Melanie Mcfarlane. She's out in Moose Jaw, and she wrote a story about a little girl named Macy finding a mermaid on the prairies. And I just love that. I wanted to know all about how the mermaid got there. I wanted to know what was going to happen to the mermaid, what was going to happen to Macy. I wish Melanie did a sequel. So I'm just putting it out there. I want to know what this treasure hunting 12-year-old Macy is going to do. It's part of the Orca Currents line right here. And I love the cover. It has sparkles. So I already love that about it. I think it's a really great cover, and it is ultra readable. So it has all the great things to make it easy for a kid to get through, or someone like me who just, sometimes I don't want to commit to a big long book. So this is one I really recommend, and brand new. I think it just came out in January.
Great, thank you. And what was great is, I just asked you all to talk about one that you liked, but we managed to get a pretty good range, which is very indicative of our list and how we do have so many titles, but there is something for everyone. So I try to keep that in mind as I continue to acquire. And you think I don't think I'm ever going to run out of stories. Like I'm just always, what I get next, yes, we have to do this one. So that's actually the pretty exciting part of my job. But I think that we need to make sure we leave enough time for questions. Yeah, I'm running a little bit over. So I'm going to go to the Q&A. I'm doing this like myself. So I'm going to go in there and read and see what we have. And then I'll just start from the top. And one of you will be my lucky, unless it's for me, but we'll see. So I'm just going to, yeah. So, the first one's from Gail Anderson Dargats. Thank you. Hello, Gail. How do you find writing Hilo compared to other writing you do? What's different and what's the same? So we did talk about this briefly. So whoever wasn't talking about that didn't answer. Does someone else want to answer that? I can't remember who talked about that. Was it? Oh, my notes are all over the place. Okay, so Paul, do you want to give it a try?
I think everyone on this panel's gotten an email from me, so they know concision isn't a strength of mine. I found it very hard to go shorter. And we all talked about condensation and getting all the good stuff and shrinking it down into a shorter book. So one of the things I do find is very important for writing a Hilo for me is focus. And you do have to narrow that focus and really keep your focus. So eyes on the prize, this is a story, this is the character, you have to know who they are, know where you're going. And I'm a plantser, so not a plotter and not a pantser. I fall right in the middle. You need to do a bit of plotting for a Hilo. You need to have a strong plot.
Oh, I didn't know if I was still on or not. I was looking for but I was still on there. But thank you, Paul. And yeah, pantser versus plotter. I think I'll just comment on one of the things about the Hilo process. I sometimes force pantsers to be plotters just for the initial, because there are some things I have to know, and I always feel bad about that because it's getting in the way of the creativity. But I also always try to remember to say, look, if you change things when you start writing this thing, that's fine. I just needed there to be a skeleton frame so that we could go forward. So thank you, Paul. I have a question from Marguerite. Hello, what is the average word count in Hilo? We tend to be, with the currents and soundings, between 15 and 16,000. With the new anchor, it's between 6 and 8,000, so half the size. And another question from Marguerite is, I'm not sure what she's in reference to. Oh, maybe for all the special effects that Marty had going. She's asking, what program do you use for that?
It's a combo platter. I use Ecamm Live for virtual presentations, but I also use Keynote to make the animation and DaVinci Resolve to make the movie. So there are many YouTube tutorials out there that will teach you everything that you need to know. But be careful, it's a rabbit hole. You can go down there and never come back.
Thanks, Marty. I have a question here from Sarah Cashmore. How do our authors approach a new story idea differently in terms of plot, outline, characters, etc., when you have Hilo specifically in mind? I know I have an answer to that, but does anyone else want to speak to that? Tash?
As I joked, pointing at myself, I am really not a plotter at all. I always say, like, I can outline a novel as much as I like, but as soon as I put the characters on the page, within 2 chapters, they've gone completely rogue and everything that I planned has gone. But with Orca, because I have to actually have like a full skeleton and like all of the points that are going to develop, and because it's shorter, I guess there's less time for them to just like go off into the wilderness and go rogue and for everything to explode. But the way that Tanya helped me shape my outlines originally reminds me of snowflake outlining, where you come up with like a general concept, like 1 or 2 sentence overview, and then you go from there and kind of expand it into more detail. And then you end up with a chapter structure, just basically sentence by sentence or a few sentences, which makes it a lot easier for me when it comes to the actual writing. So big shout out to Tanya for holding my hand through how to make a plot when you don't just unleash everyone and see what happens. I literally didn't even know who killed the person in my murder mystery that I wrote. I didn't know who the murderer was until I was like 92% of the way through. And then I was like, what? It was you the whole time? Who knew? Wasn't me.
Never boring. Thanks, Tash. I have a question about subject matter. Is it still aimed at challenging issues, teenish? I think this might be a reference to Soundings, which originally we're saying that we wanted gritty. And I think that is how we distinguish ourselves with the Hilo, is that the Soundings titles were dealing with some dark stuff, some lots of sex, lots of drugs, lots of violence, but that is no longer the case. I am looking for anything that readers can relate to, which opens it wide open. So no, I'm not looking for just dark and dangerous for Soundings. I'm open to, we have some sweet love stories in there now, some fantasy titles, and yeah, so anything goes. And then another might be the same person asking the question, I'm not sure. How many books do we publish in a year? And for which cohorts? So we have, I'm keeping it focused on Hilo. We have the 2 lines. Currents is for middle grade, and we do about 8 of those, 2 seasons, 4 in each season a year. And it's the same for Soundings, which is for the teenagers 12 and up. Not necessarily teenagers, from 12 and up, because there's lots of ESL adults who are reading Soundings as well. And with our new line of Anchor that is also aimed at the 12 and up, we are going to do between 4 and 8 titles a year. I'm just answering all the questions. I have one from Matab. Hello. Are there any particular topics you're looking for the Hilo based on demands from schools or market information? I don't want to hog all the talking, but I do often get asked, what am I looking for? And I am not looking for anything. I am looking for great stories, and I'll know it when I see it. But that said, we do absolutely take into account what the sales team brings back from talking to schools, going to conferences, and but that's in a more, it's usually in a more general, like we really want more hockey stories, or we want strong female characters, or so it's general, but it really does point towards trends. And I don't acquire based on trends, for one thing, but it is very informative in terms of how story acquisition will evolve for me. One of the things I don't, because of trends, it takes us 2 years to get a book out. So I acquire something, it's going to be published 2 years from now. So following a trend doesn't make a lot of sense. Joanne, hi Joanne. Do I want COVID to factor into stories? That's complicated because my answer is no. I don't want to hear about pandemic. I don't want to hear about COVID. I don't want to, but that's not realistic. And I've had some really creative stories come in that are treating it as almost like thematically. So I would never say no to one that was COVID or pandemic based. But also remember, it's going to be 2 years from now. So let's hope this is not a thing we're talking about in 2 years. How are we doing for time, Cabria? Oh, we still got
we've got about 5 minutes left. Yeah.
It's good. I want to start talking at double speed. Jean Mills has a question mentioning adults read Hilo. We do have a line, rapid reads for adults. We're not currently acquiring for that line right now. But we have quite a few titles in that, and they are still being sold and promoted as we do with all of our backlist. Oh, this is not for me. Do you find it easier to start writing in the simpler language, or to write whatever words come to mind and then simplify later? Who would like to take that? Natasha?
It doesn't matter. Right? Like when you are starting to write, my friend, get it on the page, just write it, because that is your brain trying to tell you the story. And that is what edits are for. And that's what the delete button is for. And that's what revisions are for. And so I will lovingly remind all of us that when we come to writing, it is not like a test. We don't have 3 hours to get it perfected on the page, because once the bell rings, that's it. And we either pass or fail, right? So get it on the page, take a breath from it, and then try again, and then look at the revisions and the standards that Orca sets. But don't hamper yourself out of the gate right away, right? Don't try to write perfect, because then you'll never get it done.
Great answer. Thank you. That was a great answer. Paul, did you want to speak to that?
I completely agree with what Natasha says. I also think that character voice is important. And you have to think about your character and creating them from the beginning, how they're going to sound. If you have a character who's using $1 million words, that's not going to relate to your Hilo reader necessarily. So my character is not going to be saying applique. My character will be saying quilted. And it's a small difference, but it does build your character in a way. So it's something to keep in mind when you start thinking about, how do I give authentic voice? I'm not going to have a kid who uses huge words and long sentences. I'm going to have a kid who, instead of saying turquoise, that's blue. And that kid's going to be very relatable, especially for a Hilo reader who probably isn't going to say that's turquoise over there. They're going to say it's blue.
Great, thank you. Marty.
I would echo what Paul and Natasha said, but I would add on, simplifying language doesn't mean simplifying the character. That you still have to make them real and authentic, and you are writing for teens, and they may be reading at a lower level, but don't fall in the trap of going, well, if they're only reading at a grade 3 or a grade 2 level, then the subject matter or the characters should be relatable to somebody in those grades. They're still very much human beings that are reading, and they want to read something that's relevant to them. It's just that their vocabulary might not be where their peers are, but their sense of the world is very much at the level of their classmates and their peers. So don't write down. Don't ever write down to a group. Write real characters and write relevant characters for that particular age group.
Yeah, I feel like say that louder for the people in the back, right? Like writing simple is not writing down, and it's so insulting. Like respect and love your reader, right? Well said, Marty. Really well said.
I agree. Thank you, Marty. I have a question here about, I've noticed a lot of successful novels written in verse. Is that something you accept? That is true. Novels in verse are very, I've read some beautiful ones, but that is not appropriate for a readership learning to read. So no, I would not be accepting in verse for Hilos. Vivian Gorman is asking, she's writing a YA novel, hoped to be a Hilo book. Became a lot more complicated than I thought it would be. I think a lot of people here would relate to that. Your story just gets out of hand and gets bigger, but it's the story it's meant to be. So I would say go with your gut on that. She's asking if she should try to pare the story back or go with a longer traditional novel. I think you trust your instincts on that. I don't want to tell you, oh yeah, make it fit into my guidelines. It's not my book, it's yours. Tash, do you want to speak to that?
I think always just write, like figure everything else out at the end. I meet so many authors who are like, I'm 3 pages into my first novel and I've chosen my cover artist, or like I'm designing my website, and it's like, those are all good things, but maybe write the book first. Like you can figure out what the book wants to be once it's on paper. If it ends up 65,000 words for your first draft, you're probably not going to be able to pare it down to a high-low. So see what it is and then let it become itself, let it become the best version of itself, and then decide what to do with it.
Yes, thank you. That's great. And yeah, you definitely just, the story is the story it's going to be, and then you find the right home for it. There's a couple here that perhaps I was confusing the audience. Free verse and high-low, that would not work in this form. So that was the nature of the previous question asking about that. So that is not something that I would be interested in inquiring. There's a question about middle grade. Most of this discussion seems to be for teens. I'm sorry if I wasn't clear on that. We have 2 lines. The currents is for middle grade. So those are readers up until age 14, and between 10 and 14 for currents. And then the sounding is from 12 and up. Another question here, is it easier to, oh, it's not, it's a writer question, yay. Do you find it easier to start writing in the simpler language? Oh, did we answer that already? Or yeah, it's just a similar question, I guess. And we decide we'll just write whatever and then we'll figure it out later. I think, Cabria, correct me if I'm wrong, I have been through all of the questions.
I think there's a few, it's not quite showing up in order, some of them, but we are over the time now. So I would recommend that if anybody had a question that wasn't answered today for Tanya, for our authors, feel free to reach out to Orca Books. In the chat, you should be able to find our email there, and also all our social media handles. We'll be posting and sharing about all the authors' social media handles as well after this on Twitter. And so you can tweet at them, you can tweet at us, and we'll do our best to answer any question or discussion that we weren't able to get to today.
Okay, and don't go away just yet. Thank you to all of the panelists for participating in this. They were such a fun bunch. I learned a lot. And to the registrants, I hope you found it interesting. I just wanted to read here that you'll be happy to hear that we have a coupon code for you, 30% off all Hilo books to all registrants, in case you feel like picking up any of the titles we talked about today. And look for that code in your inbox. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, panelists. You're awesome.